Go. All right. Maybe we could start by just having you give an update on where you are with your particular class, particular semester, how things are going in general.
Okay, so things haven't started yet here. I'm at work. We start on Wednesday, so the 20th. And so I've been doing classroom prep for that. It's kind of an interesting that I'm at. I always get nervous before the semester, and so I'm a little nervous.
That never goes away.
Okay. Yeah. Well, good to know. It's normal. Yeah. But yeah, so I'm getting ready to get started, and I'm gonna be implementing my BALM activity this spring. Assuming nothing else crazy goes wrong. COVID shutdowns last spring actually delayed the implementation of this activity, but I have the resources in place and the plan, at least, for how it is supposed to be executed. And I think the students are going to like it, and I think they will get a lot out of it. But the way I feel about it right now is I'm going to learn an awful lot while I'm doing it, and hopefully make it much better the next time. But I'm hoping to do it strong this first time. So
you got to start somewhere, right? What is the activity, briefly?
Yeah, so it's the development of a game which will help students to further understand endocrine mechanisms using diabetes. So they have to develop a diabetes game, and they get some freebies. Like, part of the game can be like, oh, what are some things you can do to prevent type 2 diabetes? But they also have to have mechanism-based questions so that they will hopefully get to that deeper level of understanding.
So ultimately, it's like a case study type approach.
Yeah, except they develop a board, like they're supposed to create a physical board game, and then on the last day of class, they play it. So
that's neat. We've had some interesting deliverables, animations, things like that. I don't think we've had a board game yet, so that will be a neat addition to the group.
Yeah.
And Carlos has now joined us. Carlos, how are things? Are you? You must have the day off, I imagine, at NC State.
In theory, yes.
Yeah. Well, because we're unusual. We're actually in class today. I feel like we're the only school in the United States of America.
Oh, wow.
Not only because now I thought Rebecca had a little solidarity with me, but now I'm hearing she hasn't started yet. So no, we're a step further. We're literally, it's just Monday here. We have to be the only school doing that. But so what are you up to?
So we start classes tomorrow. So
are you nervous? We were just talking about that.
I am, because even though I shouldn't say this, even though I'm not teaching as many classes as I usually do, I feel like we have to change a lot for lab-based classes to do them online. And this is the last one of the set that I teach that I haven't really transformed to an online thing. So even though I have learned lessons from the other two, this one is one that is really hands-on. They are all hands-on, but this one conceptually to understand, it's all based on yeast and genetic engineering of yeast. So it's a lot of recombination and tactile activities that we're going to do online using worksheets and Poggle and some we're beta testing a new screen capture recording system that our campus is moving to Panopto. Oh, wow. So you can annotate videos. So we're recording little videos. I haven't recorded my little video for for module 1 that opens this week. My co-instructor is my significant other, who's on me for not doing that video. And yesterday that I tried, we had kids yelling.
And so you live with said co-instructor, I assume.
Yeah,
That could be awkward. Yes.
yeah. And yesterday, what I've told Claire what I'm trying to do, and you may appreciate the insanity of this, but she's like, "That's an awful lot of work, Carlos." But okay. So I've been trying to include for all assignments. If I post a prompt, I'll include for the other 2 classes. I included an audio track of me describing the activity, and it's basically me reading the instructions to them, and they can on Moodle they can just click play and listen to it. And I know as taking some classes, I've really enjoyed that. So I've committed myself to do this, and but I did not realize that the long weekend would involve kids running around and trying to record. And yesterday was just like bad recording day, so they'll get some background sounds.
And you guys are you guys completely online still?
We're not, which is interesting. We the campus came back yesterday.
Oh, wow.
And they are doing weekly COVID testing, and several of our labs are doing in-person labs, and they are making them optional. Students overwhelmingly said yes to those, and I'll put yes with an asterisk because I, we asked students if they would do in lab sessions, and 95% yes. But I also know that the ones taking the classes are probably the ones that self-selected to do that, and other ones dropped. So
Exactly. And what was the Panopto you said it was? How do you spell that?
Panopto is cool. So we I love technology, which is bad.
I usually have to be
But
drag kicking and screaming, so you were opposite ends. Like once
oh,
something becomes mainstream, I like it, but like I'm not the person who's first on board with any new tech.
let me just find a quick link.
Yeah.
It's basically screen capture software, but it integrates with the LMS. And what's nice is that it has really good captioning and really good editing of captioning. And the other thing that I like that I did not know before talking it up to Claire and getting myself on this um, early adopter group is that students can pause the video and can ask a question in the video. So at minute 5 you can put it like a post-it, and we can have really cool. Hopefully we can have really cool discussions. So what we did yesterday was make a video of the 2 instructors adding comments to their own video, and you can embed quizzes and stuff, and it has Moodle integration, so we can students can respond with their own videos. We'll see how it works.
That is
Several
pretty
switches have not been flipped on. So there are several things, like I was really excited yesterday and I'm like, let's do this, and it didn't work.
See, I usually rely on people who are passionate about this, like you, to like iron out the bugs, and then like once you guys figure out the bugs, then I can come in and benefit from the mistakes you made. Because it's just sometimes I look at these things, I'm like, yeah, there's too many buttons, I can't figure it out. That sounds really cool though. Like the
Oh, you'll
potential
love
there.
this.
Yeah.
Claire goes ahead and records like 3 videos. And we're on this list server for the group, and they are like, please don't record videos on the test server because then students don't have access to them. And the one who was lazy and hasn't done it yet doesn't encounter that issue.
That's funny. So Anjali now joins us. How are you doing? What are you up to work-wise? Have you started yet? All those good intro questions.
Yeah, I have one class to teach this semester on Fridays. And I was working on a submission that was last week. January 13th. And as I was submitting my proposal in Fastlane, I realized that it's due on February 10th. So yeah.
Oh,
And then they said, oh, then I was like in a haste contacting the program officer, and is that correct? And so I didn't submit it. And
you
I'm
thought it
still,
was due last Friday?
it was due. The actual, the original RFP it said that it's due January 13th.
Ah.
But then in the fast lane, the submission was saying it's February 10th. So I was kind of surprised.
You need to be careful about these things. I'm actually in the middle of a process right now where a similar thing happened, where we're halfway through writing a proposal that was due at the end of March, and 2 weeks ago they called out a new solicitation. It was due a week later, which is great, but all of a sudden there's like all these new rules. It's like, oh, holy crap! Like, I guess we gotta go back and retool some of this stuff because like they changed the rules midstream on us. So.
Yeah.
Yeah, I sympathize there, although it's good you have more time, I suppose.
Yeah. So maybe get some letters, and I have a meeting with Michael tomorrow about that. So um, so this is an HSI, NSF HSI grant that I'm submitting. So.
Nice. Well, here is our paper for discussion today. And this is, and it's always the case when we look at papers like this, that I sort of, just because of my own weaknesses, gloss a little bit over the statistical side of the equation. But nonetheless, appreciated the work that's done here to try to um, figure out what it is that supports and resists people to successfully develop active learning based classes for their own curricula. And so this paper utilizes instructors who have been to a summer institute. And so, because they've been to a summer institute, they have been through workshops that talk about evidence based teaching, or EBT, as they're going to call it throughout the paper. That when I first read it, I'm like electronic transferred. I had to get that out of my head. The idea here is sort of figure out what is preventing people, what are the most significant things preventing people from actually doing what evidence has shown to be effective. And so they have here, this thing jumps. There we go. They have here this very simple figure, but basically is the punchline of what it is they're trying to do. I've got my supports, I've got my barriers, and how are each related to how much evidence-based teaching you are doing. So basically your positives, your negatives, and let's look at the balance of the positives and the negatives, and let's figure out what it is that is stopping people. And can we then remedy that? And so you've got the positives, you got the negatives. And so the hypothesis, when you get, especially in their discussion, they presume that the issue is going to be the negatives, right? That you have barriers, and those barriers are preventing people from implementing these practices. So if only we overcome the barriers, we can solve the problem. Turns out it's the opposite, at least by what we see in this paper. It wasn't the presence of barriers, but the lack of supports. So that's the punchline. And so the question is, how accurate do we find that? What do we think of the structure of this overall? And then I think most importantly, how does some of this relate to your own experiences in terms of developing some of these practices? What have you found to be useful to you in your process? And what has hindered you in your process? And so there are some fairly extensive tables in here, but I wanted to start by going over sort of their definition of what they call a support and what they call a barrier. And so you see here some examples of categories they came up with: academic receptivity, logistics, student receptivity, and personal teaching preference. And they give you an example of what a support would look like and what a barrier would look like. This took me a few readovers to, I think, grasp, because at first glance, it's almost like they're taking the same idea and just simply expressing it in a positive way and expressing it in a negative way. And I had to think about it in, I think, a little more detail to try to split hairs and get apart like what an actual support would be and what an actual barrier would be in this case. So I think to start, um, what is your sort of reaction to these categories, and probably more importantly, how they are defining them, or how they were defining supports and how they were defining barriers? Does it work? Is it adequate for what they're trying to do here?
I thought it was a really interesting paper. And there were a couple of things that I thought were kind of interesting that I'll share right off the bat. So for one thing, they talk about how their paper doesn't look into quality and how often these active learning activities are repeated. And I thought that was really interesting. And I liked that they talked about that as being like a direction this could go, because I do.
Which, by the way, is exactly the same thing that Palm is doing, that we're assessing implementation of active learning, but we're not assessing quality of active learning. And that's something we've been talking about as a next direction. So we can parallel that perfectly.
But yeah, and it's hard for me to know how effective it's being and if I should put more into my big courses. So like easy things that I'll do are like think, pair, shares, quizzes, partner quizzes. Like I always start the class with questions about previously covered material. And I guess to my mind, it's hard for me to imagine how that would hinder student learning. But at the same time, it's like, is there maybe something I could do that's more effective, especially considering like the constraints that I have? Like there's so much content to cover. And so that's really interesting to me. And the other thing that I thought was kind of interesting, well, I guess there's two more things. I'm sorry.
Go for it. What's nice when there's only three other people here. You can give the full the full set of ideas.
But yeah, student receptivity is a really interesting one to me, because I have noticed in my classes that students like active learning, but there is a bias against it, which I don't know is captured in this paper. Although I don't think this is something unique that I've only observed, like, or whatever, but like they can straight up hate it, or they can like it, but think that it makes the class sophomoric. And if you're going to put active learning in your classes, it means that like maybe this isn't something they need to take as seriously because there is scaffolding to the learning. And that's something that I struggle with because I teach like kind of a spectrum of classes. Like A&P has a reputation of being very, very hard. But I also teach upper division, but elective classes. And so my students there kind of have the expectation that it's not going to be as hard. And sometimes that's true. Sometimes it's not.
I would also say with A&P, it's not only the reputation for difficulty, but the reputation for being memorization based, that there's no other way around just going through, taking it in, spitting it back out. And so, and I don't teach A&P, so I can't speak to this very competently, but the challenge of doing active stuff in a class like that seems extra extra hard from where I'm sitting. So yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And so yeah, it's a how do you change perceptions, I guess, about that is kind of interesting too. And then the last thing I'll say is I thought it was really cool that they pointed out that some instructors have teaching preferences, and their preference might be to not interact with the students as much because like they aren't comfortable doing that. And I have social anxiety myself, so it's like I'll force myself to like do these small active learning things, but at the same time it was like, oh, well, I guess you're not the only one. And I kind of wish there was like a codex of like resources for people, like how do you deal with student interactions. What I end up doing is I just bother my colleagues a lot, and that may be annoying to them, but I thought that was a neat thing.
Well, and yeah, actually, that statement you just made speaks to one of the other issues that are cited in this paper, and that is the culture of your department or the issues in your department. And it sounds like you have support in your department, which is really cool. Not everybody gets to have that.
Yeah.
You speak to a lot of interesting ideas there about how much active learning one uses in a class and when is it appropriate, when is it not appropriate. And sometimes there is such a thing as too much. And so when is the appropriate time to implement some of these activities, and when is a more traditional classroom setting more appropriate? Anjali, you look like you were going to say something.
Um, I had a general comment on the categories.
Yeah.
The categories that they have listed, um, they can be they broadly categorize them as academic, logistic, and personal teaching preference. There could be more categories, no?
Oh, for sure.
For sure,
Um,
yeah.
I guess the question here, they need to find some way to make sure they have distinct groups, but then also keep it manageable. And
Yeah,
so I assume this is a Goldilocks situation where like this was the um, most simple approach they could have while also acknowledging the diversity of responses that they got. But you could absolutely look at these categories and question if they are correct, if there should be more, if they should be reclassified for sure.
yeah, yeah. And and their data set was only coming from a research intensive university. That was the only.
Yeah, that's a fair point because you're coming out from participants in summer institutes, which by
Mm,
definition are people who are at research intensive schools. So that is certainly a limitation to consider, that you're not getting a broad spectrum of all of the people available. If you want to be stereotypical, you could assume that people at smaller schools may have easier time implementing some of these. I'm not sure that's always the case, but I guess that's the bias that this comes from, or at least that's where the data was available from. That's a good observation, though.
yeah,
All
and,
right.
and I would be interested in, as there are more networks and consortiums or other communities of practice that are being targeted, or that are under development, focusing on two-year institutions to encourage faculty to do more active learning in their classrooms. As an example of Kimberly's work in the Bay Area with the folks
Kimberly
of
Tanner.
Kimberly Tanner's
Yeah.
work in the Bay Area colleges, and I would be very interested in to see the replication of the same study at two-year institutions only, and that probably is will open a whole new can of worms in terms of the category.
I think that as time goes on here, that you will see a richer body of data from two-year schools. And we're certainly, I think, in catch-up mode on getting that data together. But as people have appreciated the sheer volume of our students that go through two-year schools, I think you will see that data start to emerge.
Yeah.
I really thought the analysis was interesting.
Yeah, definitely.
The D3 that's on the screen and showing that the support network that support for had many more interactions than some of the barriers, and I had to look
You
at
want
that
this one
figure
here?
A
Yeah.
and B twice because I'm like, what's going on? And once I figured it out a little, I thought it was really, as you mentioned, really telling. Um, it's almost like a snowball effect that you usually have more of these supporting categories than the barriers.
So can I ask them, based on what you're saying, what is your interpretation here in terms of what is being said? Because I myself had to look at this a couple times, so I'm curious to know how you read it.
That does, if there are more, it's not causation, but there's more association of some of these supportive behaviors. If there's one, for example, th- there are more others associated.
So if I have something available in my particular institution or my particular department that is supportive or available to me as a resource, it's likely some of these other supports will also be present as well.
Yes, and it's interesting because it trickles down to some of the reds, right? Academic receptivity and some of the student side. So
And
maybe if the department's doing it, the students are more used to it and
it looks
receptive.
like the core of what's here is related to personal teaching preferences, that if there's a support for one thing that you do, there'll be support for others. And one of the things I think we try to work against is the notion of a one size fits all model, that, you know, something works for me doesn't mean it's going to work for you. And I think the evidence bears that out as well. Academic receptivity is off to the side here, which makes some degree of sense because I could see culturally it's likely your department is either going to be on board with some of these changes or maybe more rigid about it. So I could see that being a little more case by case, and which would put it over to the side because you'd have less association. But this seems to be the important figure, arguing that you have more connections among the supports than among the barriers. Not that removal of barriers isn't important, but that there's more predictability to the supports that are present. And so it may be easier to attain the goal here through addition of supports as opposed to removal of barriers.
I had a question,
Please.
and maybe I didn't understand it enough. On the same figure, the size of the dots is a indicator of the relationship. So the stronger the bigger the dot, the more stronger relationship.
That is actually a good question, and I don't think that is the case. I think because you actually look at the relative sizes, I think you're actually looking at two different scaled diagrams. And so,
Oh,
and because everything was more clustered in
Yeah.
the supports, they were able to zoom in on it more. It's odd to ask for a scale bar for something like this, but it seems like that would have been appropriate. That we're zoomed further out on B than on A because we need to be in order to see all the different outputs that come out.
yeah, it makes sense, and they're so far apart, especially so.
Yeah.
That,
A point you mentioned about frequency of these activities, because their survey is uh, really focused on those supportive environments and barriers. But I know, probably because I did a survey, I think I did a summer institute, and then I think Brian Couch and others have done a survey that asks for the frequency of a series of their evidence-based practices or active learning teaching pedagogies that they deliver or talk about in the summer institutes, including the mobile summer institutes, and they surveyed faculty about the frequency that they had done them. And I'm not sure if that came out or when that's coming out.
I'm not sure. Does that mean you're one of the data points on here?
And not on this one. I think I'm a data point on the frequency paper.
Let's see here.
Because they stopped this one at 2014, I think was the last year.
Right, because it said 5 years of.
And I did that in 2015 or 2016.
So, and what they do, in fact, let me, this is put later on, but this actually becomes really important. These are the best teaching practices, and they ask for the percentage of individuals who actually use these in their class. So if you had gone to a summer institute, these are the types of things. And I would ask, I guess, Carlos, you've actually been, so if I'm speaking out of turn here, let me know. The general principles that would be promoted at a summer institute. And just because something is promoted as the best practice and evidence supported doesn't mean that you're going to find it useful for your own situation. And so here it's asking which ones are most relevant to your particular classes, which ones you might choose to use. And so you see the fluctuation here, but then they mention they do something called an implementation score, like went through, figured out how many of these you used, and they gave you, not listed to my knowledge here, a rating of how many of these you actually used to talk about degree of active learning implementation. That then becomes important back here. Whoops, I forget what order everything is in here. Where's my table, or where's my figure? There it is. Which ones go together here? Another factor they consider in this research is the correlation between these supports and these barriers and the implementation score that they see as well. So if you're doing more of the supports, or if you have fewer of the barriers, would your implementation score be therefore higher? So they're trying to quantify this as much as possible. Okay, so if we look at these tables, if we sort of get into the meat of the data here with some of these things here, they went through some of the open response questions, and what they're looking for are the supports that they saw and the percentage of people who identified them. And so you'll see here the asterisked ones are the ones, I'll show you here, significantly related to implementation. So these are the ones that showed up with people who had the higher implementation scores. So a lot of people say them. It doesn't necessarily mean that just because a lot of people say them that they're going to tie into high implementation, right? Those are two separate ideas. But you look down the list here, I think this is something that I'd just be curious about your own experiences. In terms of supports, what are things from this list that especially resonate with you, or are there things that are missing that you think should be included? Just to start here, I noticed they mentioned covering core material over here on the far right. When we talk about active learning and we talk about some of the exchanges one makes between developing of group works or projects or things like that, taking time away from what would be traditional lecture, one of the things I know that tends to worry people is that concept of core material. Although it's a relatively low percentage here, it may speak to people being more comfortable with, you know, what truly needs to be taught in a given class versus what we think is core material evolving over time. So if we just take a look at the list here, are there particular things that are especially relevant to your situation?
I like that one is directly opposite to I enjoy coming up with class activities.
Right here.
On the other side with
Yeah.
a 57%. I'm like, yep, that makes sense.
I don't know if I enjoy coming up with activities. I know as I'm going through, so I'm teaching a seminar. I'm basically teaching an honor seminar right now that's very much focused on class discussion. If people just sat there and stared at me, it would get real boring real quick. And a lot of times, as I'm writing down questions the day before, I look at how they're going, and what I want to do activity wise simply just presents itself. But there is anxiety that, like, I'm gonna look at it and, like, yeah, I have no idea how to make this more enriching, like that I'm not creative enough to come up with something for a particular situation. So I certainly fear that sometimes.
I fear being able to cover content without a lecture.
Yeah. Tell me about that. Is this your A&P, or is this some of the other classes as well?
Honestly, I'm pretty sure it'd be any class that I teach. I would say A&P in particular because there's a couple of reasons. I worry that when I'm standing in front of a big group of people, I won't remember every point that I was hoping to bring up. So I'll forget something that I thought was key to helping them remember X, Y, or Z. Also, I like PowerPoints because you can put images into them. And so I'll often go freeboard and like have a picture and then try to draw out, say, a mechanism. And I feel like that's helpful, but
Yeah.
it's also really helpful for them to have something to compare my poor drawing to and be like, okay, this is where she is.
I had a now retired colleague who excelled at just putting these really ornate pictures together on just a marker board, and he was just amazing at illustration. And I'm like, wow, I can't do that. I need those pictures like you're describing.
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, that's my main anxiety. And like, I guess too, I think the students like having PowerPoints because the problem though is they kind of use it like a crutch. Oh, I have this thing and that's all I need. I don't need to say annotated or.
I tend to do when possible. I mean, it's not always work. It doesn't always work out, but PowerPoints that are question driven as opposed to statement driven. Like, can I put something up? But what I have on there are questions as opposed to just writing out, this is this, this is this. Because then, yeah, you're exactly right. I used to struggle with, do I actually post PowerPoint slides before a class, because I didn't want them just to check out. And that was what I found was useful as an alternative. Like, post this thing before, but they still have to pay attention to figure out like what I'm trying to get at on the particular
Yeah.
slides. I'm not going to say it's perfect, but it certainly seems to be effective to some extent. Also well represented on here. I enjoy being interactive with students. I imagine we wouldn't be here if we didn't agree with that. And it's funny, Rebecca, you mentioned social anxiety, because I find a huge parallel between people who do this for a living and people who have social anxiety, which is super bizarre because they're against those work against each other. But like we seem to be drawn to that sort of work, and we can put on the song and dance when necessary. It seems to be very common in our line of work. You also mentioned the support that you've gotten from your department, and so I was wondering, Carlos and Anjali, do you also find that the culture that you guys are working in provides support, or is that more of a barrier where you are?
I, I'm lucky that I'm 100% of my teaching is in a program that's molecular biology and lab based, and really takes pride in making as and I stopped myself last week for saying it, but inquiry based or open ended or research driven courses. So I think evidence based practices and active learning fit well with our core goal and the infrastructure we have. So my program is really supportive. My department is really fantastic. So I'm in biological sciences, and we're lucky. We have an awesome department chair and a really strong teaching faculty. community. So I'm what we call professional track or teaching faculty. But I do see challenges with and pushback from people teaching, and rightfully so, multi-section classes with 100 people saying, "Oh, you can't really do some of the assignments you do, Carlos, because you can't view 400 videos or listen to 400 podcasts."
Right, which is a whole other subset of questions we could ask about doing all this to scale, which is at a
Yeah.
school with a total of 1,000 students, something I never have to think about, which is something I'm grateful for. But there are some really inspiring things that are frankly done in the larger situations. Anjali, how about you and these supports? How do you respond to these?
Uh, so when I find myself the only one doing these kind of things, seeking out professional developments and trying to do different things in my classroom, because there is a lack of communication. I think I am referring to the last paper that we discussed, that the people who are doing things, and given the difference in the dynamics of the institution, it's highly teaching focused, people are swamped. And if I do want to uh, establish a cure or something, then I have to work with the other faculty who may not necessarily be inclined to work on that. So yeah, I have a totally different ball game that I have to or dynamics that I have to deal with. But the administrators are supportive, so
Cool.
they don't limit me from doing things what I'm trying to do.
So now I just switched over. This is the barrier list. And so basically, same question. Number one on this list, not surprisingly, I do not have time to prepare class materials. I think this is something we can all relate to some extent, that we have the best laid plans. I know I overplan myself repeatedly, and like I've got like a particular class that I've meant to change around for a couple of years now, and then all these other things happen, and then it just doesn't change. So same idea here, that particular restrictions can come into play and keep you from doing what you want to do. So we seem to be blessed as a group here with having supportive departments, at least, or if not supportive, at least not restricting you from making changes or doing things into your classes. Something that's interesting in here that I think we've touched on a little bit is the response. I think, Rebecca, you had some very thoughtful things to say about this. The student response to these particular things, student receptivity, varying pretty significantly, probably, depending on what kind of class it is. And then there's the question of, do the students receive it well? And then do the students actually get anything out of it? Which admittedly is not really what they're testing here. So that, with that soliloquy aside, what particular things on here are most relevant to your particular situations?
I suppose for me, under personal teaching, the very first one, it's not that I have a hard time coming up with activities, but I do worry about how effective they are. And I'm getting better at this, but historically I've not been good at conveying to students what they're supposed to get out of it. Like, why are we doing this? And I think that can lead to this sort of feeling of like, oh, I am doing busy work. So that's something I'm working on. And then for under logistic, I worry that we won't be able to cover all of the required core material.
Sure.
So that's the other one.
A couple of the student receptivity ones, I could see myself responding to being part of that 21% for I am worried about my students who have a hard time focusing, taking the group work off task. I am concerned about my
It happened
students
to be
who
this
are
morning, that's why
far
I'm laughing about it.
and I have again, I have juniors, seniors, graduate students, and vet students in the same room.
Oh, wow.
So from 8 out of the 9 colleges on campus.
Now,
So so we have
that begs a question,
and
because I'm not in this situation, but I remember being in the situation as a grad student. Do you actually have the grad students and the undergrads in the same groups, or do you separate them?
I try to mix them up,
Okay.
and I've tried to read a little about group work, and for a while I was doing random, and then for a while I was doing structured and using surveys to put them together, and now I'm a kind of, it depends on the activity a lot,
Well, and I
but
ask because the undergraduates tend to be way more conscious of their GPA, for instance, than the graduates. And so, is
yes,
there is there anything odd to the dynamic if they're together?
there there are things,
Yeah.
and
I just
I
don't have to deal with this here, so I'm just curious how you deal with it.
it's I find it really interesting. I still haven't figured out a good system, but I try to really sell we're a community of inquiry, so we're all gonna
Mhm.
figure it out together.
Yeah.
And I'm giving you challenging projects like how to automate COVID testing with liquid
Okay.
handlers, or how to design digital PCR screen that you can only solve with interdisciplinary approaches. And that's why you have a vet student in your group or a grad student. And for the most part, everyone plays well, but I have had instances where certain disciplines are not um, used to some of the approaches.
Yeah.
And I really wanted to be interactive, and sometimes it's not received well, and it may be instructor delivery lots of times, but it's it's you don't want anyone to fall behind, and you want everyone to work as a group, but you also have to keep in mind that everyone is coming from a different academic um, background.
Yeah, I think I'm struck by, I mean, I joked about the keeping students on task, but the one underneath it
Yeah,
about students farther behind getting discouraged in group work, that one concerns me a lot. That as you're putting groups together, and one of those things that people often say is that you should design groups that are sort of cross sections. You don't have like all the high achieving kids in one group and all the low achieving kids in another group. But I do worry sometimes about people who psych themselves out, and they see people who um, either have like the incredibly hard work ethic or just are naturally talented or whatever, and they don't think they can do it. And so um, I know you can, and Carlos, you allude to it, that you can, read entire papers about just how you design
yeah.
groups and what are the ways around it. But being able to do that effectively so that I'm not inadvertently screwing up any of my students' achievement is absolutely a concern um, that I go through.
And for a while, I used engineering uses catme.org, catme. Um, and I think they charge like $1 now per user. Um, but it's nice because it has a team builder, and you send out surveys to your students, and we used to do this. And it has defined questions like schedule, how do you like to work in groups, are you more vocal, it has canned questions, and you tailor your survey to it, and then it helps you put groups together by having little levers, and you can say 50-50 mix of uh, self-identified genders, 50-50 mix of majors, 50. And for a while I was doing that, and then I'm like, ah, not seeing much, or I doomed the group and I went back to random. So I'm not sure what works.
Yeah, and I mean, it's one of those things that if someone had come up with a definitive answer,
I
they'll be using it, right? So, oh, you almost made it the whole hour.
I almost made it the whole hour.
Yeah,
No, he breaks in.
that's like the famous, even before all COVID happened, the famous the guy interviewing at the BBC, and the daughter comes like strutting in the background, and the woman goes diving in to grab her out. So, in
Yep.
general, the effectiveness of the paper appears to be pretty good. I mean, I always like papers like this that are honest about limitations. And I think Anjali's point about being only research intensive faculty is really observant. I hadn't even thought of that. That you're not getting the full diversity of faculty by using only Summer Institute alums. However, what is the alternative to doing that? I mean, it's a good source of data, but you could say, as a good next step, you might want to consider looking at a more diverse body of faculty, or, as you said before, Anjali, maybe a focus on two-year faculty as something that hasn't been looked at in any detail.
Sure. I just had one more point.
Yeah.
And I always get with these kind of studies, which all put all the evidence-based practices in one package, uh, and then try to analyze the efficacy of these overarching themes of barriers and affordances. Why don't we do a study on a subset of activities? Say, for example, people in a community doing Pogil only, or one type of that. In my view, that kind of data will be much easier to normalize. Like, for example, if this was just to focus on people doing cures.
It's a good idea, and I imagine that we're only at the point now where there may be enough critical mass to do that kind of separation.
Yeah.
I'm guessing, but yeah, there's a lot of additional questions, to then say, okay, which particular practices might be especially effective in particular situations. Like maybe it turns out for a 2-year population as opposed to a 4-year population, particular techniques work more effectively because of the unique environment. No idea.
And another thing that was brought in my palm mentoring was that, Diane, her first question to me was that, okay, how much of time do you spend doing active learning in your classroom? And I said, on the scale, are you asking, or at the time of amount of percentage? She said, yeah. So if you have to say how much percentage of time of your instruction is active learning. So, then all these different evidence-based practices, your class time is it 100% you're doing it? In your entire semester, is half of your semester active learning, other half? So all those variables, how do you account for those? So maybe I'm trying to find limitations here, because that's not was the actual theme of this paper. It was all like, okay, we all do active learning. What are the affordances and barriers? So let's explore that. So all these things that I'm saying probably are maybe offshoot of, or the next level of study for this paper, next paper.
Exactly. These are all interesting questions, though. All right. We're just about at time here. So, any other thoughts on the paper or what we've been talking about?
I think with being able to learn a little bit about Copus and seeing some Copus data, come back to your comment, Anjali, it's really hard to evaluate yourself or guesstimate how much active learning you're doing, and it varies by session, and uh, so so not to pick at the paper, but how many times you implement the technique could be really useful.
Yeah. Because if you see that Michigan State, where Diane is, they talk about transforming the biology classrooms. And when I witnessed in person their classrooms, it was 95% active learning. And the first few minutes of the classroom was just, okay, here's an activity, here's what we are doing today. And everybody just went into groups, they were reporting, and it was all discussion oriented. That's what I witnessed. There was real active learning going on. And I'm that's what I would see to do in future in the long run. One thing I really liked here, I learned new theories. so so these social science theories are these are great. I had never heard of this. So.
All right. Well, thank you guys very much for being here today. We'll have 2 more sessions talking about this paper, and then we'll move on to another topic. But thank you guys, and have a good start to your semesters.
Thank you.
Thank you.